In Chapter 16, we're going to look at the relationship between culture and leadership. This is a topic that I find fascinating as someone who's lived in different cultures, and I've seen what's been expected of leadership in the different contexts that I've worked, namely the United States and France, and to a lesser degree, Lithuania. Let's start off with a definition of culture. Now, culture can be notoriously difficult to define, but this is a pretty good, simple definition, and I'm going to work on simplifying it even more. So let's see what the book says. It says, the learned beliefs, values, rules, norms, symbols, and traditions that are common to a group of people. So it's a bunch of things that are common, that are generally shared by a group of people. Now notice how I've put in bold beliefs, because I think the beliefs are a good way of summarizing everything else that follows. Because if you think about it, values are beliefs about things that are valuable or not value. Rules are beliefs about what people should do. Norms are beliefs about things, what people should do again. Symbols are beliefs about the meaning behind symbols, and traditions are again beliefs about the common ways of doing things. So in one sense, culture is all about beliefs. Now what can we say about these beliefs? First of all, they're learned beliefs. They're not innate. You learn them as you grow up or if you move into a culture. So not all cultures are going to share the same beliefs, and that's what makes one culture different from another culture, is that they believe different things. So they're the learned beliefs that are common to a group of people. Now, a couple things here is that we're talking about a group of people, meaning that different groups can have different cultures. Now, sometimes we can talk about ethnic groups, we can talk about different cities, we can talk about different regions within a culture, but those differences tend to be pretty small compared to looking at one country versus another. Whenever you've got a separation of language, that's when culture is really different. When people share a language, their cultural differences tend not to be too great. So what we're talking about, when we're talking about groups of people, in this chapter, we'll especially focus on national cultures and looking at the difference between one country and another. But we're talking about learned beliefs that are common to a group of people. Now, what do we mean by common? Does that mean everybody shares them? No, but in general, people share them and hold them to be true. For example, in some countries, some people think that cinnamon is a good flavor for cakes, cookies, and candies. In other countries, people don't think that cinnamon is a good flavor for cakes and cookies and candy. And that would be a cultural value. Now, perhaps not. That won't influence behavior too much unless you really dislike cinnamon and you're in a country where people are eating cinnamon all the time. But that's an example of a learned belief, because people don't grow up, they aren't born liking or disliking cinnamon. It's how you're raised, and it's common to a group of people. Now, I choose cinnamon because I lived in France, and now I live in America. And Americans love cinnamon. There's all kinds of things that are flavored with cinnamon. Whereas in France, cinnamon was kind of a flavor that people knew, but it wasn't expected to be very common. And when we would serve something with cinnamon, sometimes it would surprise people. So that's going to be our definition of culture: the learned beliefs, which include a lot of things, that are common to a group of people. Now, the majority of this chapter is focused on the results of the Globe study. It was called Culture, Leadership, and Organizations, the Globe study, that was done by House and colleagues in 1991. And this was a real major study where it measured beliefs and values of managers, so people that were in some type of leadership role in organizations, in 62 countries. Now, it turns out that these types of studies are extremely difficult to do. because coordinating the efforts of people in so many countries just requires incredible networking and time. I wish more and more of these studies were being done, but they tend to be so expensive that we tend to trust these older studies. So what the Globe study did was they looked at culture of these 62 countries, and then they looked at leadership behaviors, which are different also. And as measuring a whole lot of beliefs and values, they grouped the cultures into countries into 10 different groups, and that tended to go together. So for example, here we have the Anglo countries, where they have Canada, US, Australia, Ireland, England, whites in South Africa, and New Zealand, and they tended to have a similar set of cultural values. In contrast, people in the Middle East, such as Turkey, Kuwait, Egypt, Morocco, Qatar, they also tended to have similar values. But you might think, oh wow, the people in Turkey are very different than the people in Morocco. Yeah, and that's true, just like people in New Zealand are very different than USA, but compared to other groups, whatever we saw in these groups, they tended to be more similar to each other than others. So we had Confucian, Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, South Korea, Japan. So that's pretty much what we consider East Asia. We've got Southern Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Thailand, Iran. And you might be thinking, oh, that's kind of crazy, especially including India there. It turns out that as people studied India more and more, they realized that there were so many diverse cultures in India that it's just kind of an overall average that made them go into this Southern Asia category. We've got Latin America, we've got Nordic Europe, Scandinavia, like Denmark, Finland, Sweden. We had Sub-Saharan Africa. Eastern Europe had its own distinct characteristics, and Latin Europe, or Southern Europe, sometimes it's called, had their own distinct characteristics. And that's where France is, and that's where I live. So I'm often comparing Latin Europe with the Anglo world. So those were the 10 groups of culture that the 62 countries kind of naturally grouped themselves into. Now let's look at some of the 9 cultural dimensions of the Globe study. I'm not going to look at all 9 in this. You can read about the others, but just some of the more important ones. First of all, there was this idea of uncertainty avoidance. Some cultures accept uncertainty, that no problem, we'll deal with it. Others are trying to reduce it and get everything planned out and know how everything's going to affect it. So high uncertainty avoidance is relying on established social norms, rituals, and procedures to avoid uncertainty. High would be Germanic Europe. Everything is very strict there. Behaviors in many situations very defined on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And if you violate those norms, people will let you know, even if you're a tourist. And sometimes it can get kind of funny. We were right next to Germanic Europe, and sometimes when we would go over to Germany, we would get in trouble because we would violate some norm that in France nobody cared about. An area that has low uncertainty avoidance is Latin America, where there's much more flexibility in the norms and rituals and procedures, and people deal with issues as they come up rather than trying to prevent and control them. With power distance, that's high power distance is expecting and agreeing that power should be shared unequally. So it's kind of the opposite of democratic leadership. So in some countries, in China, it's expected that those above us should be able to tell us everything that we should do and that they shouldn't necessarily listen to us. Whereas in Nordic Europe, it's very democratic and everybody's expected to have a say in what goes on. So that's something that distinguishes between cultures. Another dimension of culture is in-group collectivism. Your in-group is the people that are parts of groups that you identify with. And in some cultures, it's really important to express pride, loyalty, and cohesiveness in their organizations, in their groups, and in their families. And now this is something interesting. This is very high in Confucian Asia, in East Asia, the idea that we should be very loyal to our in-groups, that we expect much from our leaders to protect us. Whereas in Anglo countries, it's kind of looked upon. It's viewed as associated with Middle Ages and the feudalism that we should expect our leaders to defend ourselves. It's more important to treat everybody fairly, whether they're in our in-group or our out-group. So that's a third dimension of culture, is in-group collectivism. Fourth dimension would be gender egalitarianism. Should men and women be viewed differently or the same? Egalitarianism means that they should be viewed the same. It's real high in Nordic Europe, whereas in the Middle East it tends to be very low. Men and women have very strongly defined different roles in the Middle East. Performance orientation is encouraging and rewarding people for improved performance and excellence. And that is definitely high in Anglo-American countries. And that's certainly reflected in our textbook, because it's written for a North American audience. The whole idea is that leadership gives direction to groups so that they can achieve goals, so that they can perform better, so that they can do what they're supposed to. And so this performance orientation is taken for granted in the Anglo world, whereas in Latin America, it's not viewed quite as highly. In fact, it might not nearly be as important compared to loyalty and building up relationships and trust and living out one's role in society. A sixth dimension is humane orientation. That's encouraging and rewarding people for being fair, altruistic, generous, caring, and kind to others. Encouraging, as a top priority, really good relationships and caring for one another. And this is high in sub-Saharan Africa, where taking care of each other can be, even in organizations, can be viewed as more important than accomplishing the task of the orientation. Whereas in Latin Europe, that can be it can be viewed as very, very low. So those are some of the cultural dimensions that distinguish one group of countries from another, and that helps us distinguish these different cultures. Now, how does culture interact with leadership? Besides looking at differences in culture, the Globe research looked at differences in leadership behaviors that are considered important to various degrees in various cultures. And they came up with 6 sets of leadership behaviors. So these 6 sets of leadership behaviors are different than the 9 dimensions of cultural value that they came up with. They had this charismatic, value-based leadership where leaders are concerned about motivating people because of their values. And of course that was something that we saw was very important in transformational leadership. They saw that some leaders were more team-oriented, and that was valued more in some cultures than others. Some cultures valued participative leadership, democratic leadership. Some cultures valued humane, relationship-oriented leadership than others. Some cultures valued autonomous leadership that was out to do what was they were supposed to do regardless of the cost. And others, cultures valued self and group protective leadership more than others. Now let's look at see how some of these played out. We're not going to look at all of them that are presented in the book, but I'm going to look at a few of them, and that'll give you some background so that you can look at the others in the book yourself. So here we're going to look at the Anglo-American culture. So this is the English-speaking world, like Australia and Canada and UK and America and Ireland. And what they saw is that these English-speaking leaders valued very highly charismatic or valued-based leadership, participative or democratic leadership, and humane-oriented or relationship-oriented leadership. And as you can kind of tell, I've got some biases for this. The textbook has some biases for this because we're writing within an Anglo-American culture. Now, the idea of team-oriented leadership that focused more on the team than the overall task, the autonomous leadership where the leader was especially trying to promote oneself, that was kind of medium level, and the self-protective leadership, which Americans associate with feudalism, where the leader protects those that are loyal to him, was not viewed very highly in the Anglo culture. In contrast, we can look at Latin America, and there the team-oriented leadership was very high, besides the charismatic, transformational leadership, and self-protective leadership was viewed as a normal leadership behavior and something expected of leadership. But this autonomous leadership, doing one's own thing, was not viewed very highly. In the humane-oriented leadership, there wasn't that expectation that leaders would be working really hard on developing relationships and caring for people. And then a third culture we can Confucian with. A third culture that we can compare these with is Confucian Asia or East Asia. And there, the idea of self-protective leadership, where the leadership is going to take care of oneself and those that are under its authority, was very high, similar to the idea of the team-oriented leadership, that the group counted very high. Humane-oriented, charismatic, value-based leadership and autonomous leadership were medium, but participative leadership, democratic leadership, that people lower in the hierarchy should have a voice in things, was viewed very low. So this is an example of 3 different cultures, and you can read about more of the cultures in the book, and I encourage you to go through those sections in detail and compare the culture that you're in with other cultures, and that can give you a lot of insights on why something seems strange as we work with different cultures. I'd like to end with a biblical reflection. And on this question of cultures, which is really important for Christians, because Christianity is a worldwide religion. It's in all countries of the world. Almost all cultures have some people that are truly committed to Jesus Christ in it, and that's natural, because when someone does have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ, they want other people to experience that same thing. And so there's a passage about culture in 1 Corinthians 9, written by the Apostle Paul, and he talks about, as he traveled all over the Mediterranean Sea in the first century, and was dealing with lots and lots of cultures. And he said that the goal of Christianity was not to change culture, but was to help people within their own culture experience God personally. And so what did he say about dealing with cultures? He said, "I've made myself a servant to all. I have become all things to all people. I do it for the sake of the gospel." So whatever culture Paul was in, Paul would adapt to that culture and communicate things in culturally relevant ways so that people within that culture could understand it. And that's what we need to do as leaders when we're dealing with different cultures, is adapt to the situation, understand people's values, and work within that context to effectively lead them to do what's best for themselves, for the group, and for the organization.